This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. I think something which has been woefully under-discussed and under-celebrated are the creators of fairy tales that we know and love today. The Grimm brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm, get most of the credit, and indeed they are, like all collators of folklore, the only reason so many of these tales survived. But people often forget or completely don't discuss the topic that they aren't the creators of these tales, and whilst their intentions as philologists wishing to preserve the recordings of language and law were honest, their practices wouldn't pass an ethics board today were it put in front of them, primarily for their lack of citation and credit. They gave a few nods here and there, which we shall explore here, but it's contentious to say the least. I think we all know this, but the Brothers Grimm were just collators of the stories. They are not creators of them, and we don't have access to the creators of them. And it's not just the Brothers Grimm. The same is true of Andrew Lang, Charles Perrault, and, in a more scrutinous analysis of his biography and work by a couple of scholars, so is Oscar Wilde's fairy tales. Marina Warner posits the idea that Oscar Wilde likely garnered his stories for his fairy tale collection from his mother, Speranza Wilde, who collected the stories from her husband's patients who were unable to pay for their medical care. Similarly, Andrew Lang, she goes on to explain, relied heavily on his wife Leonora Aline and a team of women editors to produce his many volumes of fairy tale stories. In his book, Jubba similarly discusses how Perrault garnered many of his fairy tales from attending the Marquise de Lambert's Tuesday Salon evenings, which began in the 1690s. The salon was established to support the intellectual rights of women authors, such as Henriette Julie and Marie Catherine. Perrault was invited to attend by Marie-Jeanne Lertier, a third cousin of his actually, though she rather referred to him as Uncle Charles, because their relationship was a little bit funny in terms of age gaps. Now, the women I just mentioned are just a few of the women writers who were monumental in the production of the fairy tale genre that we know today. And yet, even though her publication of an anthology of fairy tales was published a year before his, most of us only know the Tales of Mother Goose by Charles Perrault, which was published in 1697, a few years after he started attending the Women's Literary Salon. It's not an exaggeration to say that the lion's share of fairy tales that we know and love today, or rather, the lioness's share, were created by women, told by women, created by women, and shared amongst women. They were told to women by other women and largely tackled many of the issues they faced as women, from domestic and emotional labour to marriage and children. Yet the women told their stories. They either came willingly to these curators to share their stories, or, as I demonstrated above, had their stories extracted from them in more sneaky ways. But as you can probably tell from the number of stories versus the number of male collators we have, the vast majority of women were never credited or compensated for their stories. So this video is about the overlooked history of women's storytelling culture, which has been overshadowed by the financial success of the men who took advantage of it, to say the least. But before we get any further into the video, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, which is Squarespace. So whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything from products to content to time, all in one place and all on your terms. I've gone through many iterations of my online presence, from blogging about books back in the day to running a business, and Squarespace has seen all those sides of my online evolution. I'm working on the back end of writing workshops that I'm organising so I can host all via my Squarespace website, which allows members only content for my community, where I can sell access to online courses or blogs or videos and memberships. And purchases can be anything from one-time fees to subscription access. And when it comes to evolving my business, I can make smarter business decisions with Squarespace's intuitive built-in analytics tools, which lets me review my website traffic, learn where to focus my engagement, or track revenue from bookings, invoices, or product sales, and again, all in one place. So if you're interested, you should check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/lady of the library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So I bet you've heard some form of the fairy tale trope of the elderly female storyteller. We have old Mother Goose, Mother Hubbard, Gamma Gurton, and Auntie Molesworth, just a few. And these women are elaborate inventions of male storytellers who transformed the once intended pejorative of Apuleius's Old Wives' Tale, Annulus Fabula, into a fictional figure which authenticated the folk wisdom of their stories. The fictional figure of the elderly woman storyteller reflects a reality at the time, but it was created and forefronted by men who collated folk and fairy tales, and they are the ones who subsequently controlled literary and textual culture. They appropriated the figure of the old woman in fiction and misappropriated the wisdom of women for their benefit by taking advantage of their humble social status and distance from literacy. So the Grimm brothers' most prolific sources for their tales were women. In her book Clever Maids, The Secret History of the Grimm Fairy Tales, Dr. Valerie Pardee helps pull together the names of women behind certain stories by analysing the stories and identifying voices and narrative frameworks, and then identifying those two letters that are written by these women. So Wilhelm's future wife, Henriette Dorothea Wilde, who is known as Dorchen by most, was just 19 years old when she started sharing stories with the brothers, and she contributed 36 stories, a quarter of the first collection that the brothers produced. It is only thanks to Dorchen that we have the stories of Rumpelstiltskin, the Frog King, Six Swans, the Elves and the Shoemaker, and the Singing Bone, just to name a few, and she is also posited as the most likely source of Hansel and Gretel. Janine Blackwell identifies 5 main families responsible for providing the fairy tales of Germany in the early 1800s. We have Brentano, Droste-Hulshoff, Hasenpflug, Haxthausen, and Wilde. The Brothers Grimm received no fewer than 66 tales from the aristocratic literary circle of the von Haxthausens. There were 30 women in this family, and Ludovine was the second oldest of the 16 sisters, so it's understandable that many of the tales that she contributed are those which dealt with sister relations. Another famed story from the collection is Aschputtel, Cinderella, who was told to the brothers by an old woman in poverty working in a workhouse in a small town of Marburg. Little Redcap, Briar Rose, and the Robber Bridegroom were told by Jeanette, Annette, and Marie Hasenpflug, who was a young middle-class woman of French descent who attended the storytelling circle in Hesse, the same town the brothers lived in. These sisters provided 28 stories for the brothers' first compendium. And what's interesting is that their stories hold a lot of French heritage because they were from a family which fled France during the persecution of the Protestants under Louis XIV, but they adapted many of the French stories of Madame Dunois and Charles Perrault to have a German forest setting and other Germanic details. Ironically, these 3 women eventually became in-laws of the brothers because their brother Louis married Lotte Grimm, the brothers' younger sister. Another traceable name was Jenny von Droste-Hulshoff, the niece of a man that the brothers studied law with at university. Jenny told him the story of the worn-out dancing shoes, and her aunts told them the story of the Bremen town musicians. Now, a name that gets thrown around is good old Marie, and old Marie is missing from many of the annotations of the brothers' compendium, but she was also a vital source for the stories. Her real name was Marie Müller, a widow in her 60s who, according to Dorchen's son, Hermann, provided the first volume with the most beautiful tales. Though as she had a very close relationship with Dorchen, it's very likely that her tales became Dorchen's tales. Now, the Grimm brothers didn't exactly exclude all credit. We see in the introduction of the second volume of the Brothers' Tales in 1814 credit to Dorothea Weimann, an old woman who sold fruit and vegetables, whom told them many stories, including the famed Goose Girl and the Lazy Spinner. What people have argued is problematic about this is that the Brothers Grimm used Dorothea as a symbol of their hard work. You see, they posited themselves as 2 men who went throughout the land collecting oral history and stories from Hesse, Maine and Kinzig regions, documenting the tales of the poor, decrepit, hags, wise women, old bags, shrews and gossips, witches and cronies and old biddies, whose voices were not taken seriously. Well, that's true, their voices weren't ever taken seriously. But, for the Brothers Grimm, they were purely a marketing prop, in the same way that people nowadays take photographs of themselves paying or giving money to or giving food to a homeless person on the street and documenting their good deed. The figure of the old woman in poverty was purely a prop for the Brothers Grimm, who would hate the idea that people would know that the vast majority of their stories were told to them by young upper middle class women in very comfortable settings. Most women had to come to the brothers to tell their story in their little kind of dingy apartment, but the brothers were often, invited to summer houses and front rooms of friendly acquaintances to hear these tales be told for them to document. As Jeppa writes in part 4 of the book, The Fairytales, of the 86 tales in the first printed volume of the Fairytales, more than 50 were narrated by women under the age of 25. Now, what's interesting is, in another book called One Fairy Tale Too Many, John Ellis is pretty scathing about what the Grimm brothers did. His book basically argues that the brothers deliberately set out to create the myth that their tales were told to them by poor old German peasants. And so they deliberately concealed the identities of other, more bourgeois tellers. Now, this theory, as you can imagine, ruffled a lot of feathers because, heaven forbid you criticise the beloved Grimm brothers. And when I was reading this, I thought to myself, well, I think two things can be true at once. Optics have always been optics, and everyone is guilty of romanticising their endeavours by including or amplifying details which serve their narrative that they wish to carve out for themselves. The brothers were driven to compile folktales for nationalistic reasons. They wanted to be part of a movement in creating a unified German cultural story. But additionally, these men were incredibly poor. They were only eating a single meal a day, and they needed to make money. So far that they actually sanitised their own tales to accommodate critics that they weren't Christian enough in later editions. The brothers were willing to do what they needed to do for financial success. And to me, whilst we can be critical of these practices and ungenerous nature towards women off whose stories they made money, I don't think they were any different from the global culture which saw women as second-class citizens and any marginalised group even lower than. Thus, I don't think their practices were intentionally schemed as such, rather it was just what men did at the time, and that was really the norm. And they understood optics, they understood what would sell and how to market it and what would work. And yes, they didn't give women credit because it didn't make them look great. But we still live in a society where people who do the hard work don't get the credit. At the same time, we wouldn't have these stories today had the brothers, not documented them. So really it's more of a contemporary modern day ethics board, as it were. If you were publishing this book today, people would ask you, where did you get these sources? Where did you credit the people you took them from? All that jazz, which obviously wasn't a thing back in the early 1800s. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing and giving it a like or sharing it with other people. And thank you to my patrons, as always, for making this possible, particularly my top tier patrons. We have Janice, Eric Taylor, Jenny Edvane, Marina, Psycho Teddy, Fritz Anderson, Wee Lauren, Nicholas Reed and Andrea Brazil. Thank you so much, as always. I have a wee podcast that I'm working on very slowly, I'm afraid, in the back end, trying to catch up with all my work, but I'm getting there. And I have a wee newsletter as well. All is linked down below. Thank you as always for listening, following, watching, commenting. I really appreciate it. And as always, I hope you're happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives. So keep reading.